So the problem of lack of heat, and then a lot of people in Ukraine are not properly immunized against COVID. Flu season is difficult, and as you pointed out, temperatures could go down to -20. So that's a perfect storm of risky factors.
Now, the World Health Organization has warned that the lives of millions of people in Ukraine will be under threat this winter, as half of the country's energy infrastructure has been either damaged or destroyed, and 10 million people are currently without power. Temperatures are predicted to plummet as low as -20 degrees centigrade in some areas. Well, last week, Russia hit more energy installations and civilian buildings in one of its heaviest aerial bombardments of the war. Let's talk to William Courtney, adjunct senior fellow at the non-profit, non-partisan RAND Corporation and a former special assistant to the US president for Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia, and a former US ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia. William, a very good evening to you.
Yes, hello, Carol.
Good to have you with us. This was a pretty bleak warning from the World Health Organization about the threat to millions of people through the power cuts that have been a result of the strikes on energy infrastructure carried out by the Russians.
Yes, the power cuts have cut millions of people off from electric power. The Ukrainians are doing a good job of repairing damages to the electrical grid. And that damage, by the way, can damage water supplies and other things. But the Russians continue to send missiles across aimed at energy infrastructure. So it's a competition, if you will. So the problem of lack of heat, and then a lot of people in Ukraine are not properly immunized against COVID. Flu season is difficult, and as you pointed out, temperatures could go down to -20. So that's a perfect storm of risky factors.
It does seem as though the Russian tactics now are designed to undermine the morale of the Ukrainian people.
Yes, that is the tactic, but so far it has not. And it's useful to recall the V1, V2 experience in Great Britain during the war. The Germans, the Nazis, hoped that would demoralize people in Great Britain, but it didn't. And it's not demoralizing Ukrainians either. It's caused Ukrainians to become angrier and more determined to defend their country.
Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, was out in Kyiv over the weekend there to meet President Zelensky. He pledged some more British help, but clearly what the Ukrainians continue to ask for is more air defences to try to protect the country more against these sorts of things. Do you think that there is more that the West could and should be providing to Ukraine?
Yes, and some of that is happening. There is a missile system, anti-aircraft missile system called NASAM, N-A-S-A-M, which Norway produces based on an American AMRAAM missile. And that has the capacity to hit targets at higher altitudes than the Stinger missiles that Ukraine has had since the beginning of the war. And there are other air defense systems, including a German system that are going there. Those work against slow-flying targets such as drones, but they are not adequate against fast-flying targets such as the Iskander missiles, a tactical missile, which the Russians have been firing also.
And what about the reports that we're hearing of some more shelling near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant? Now, we had a flurry of this a few weeks ago. There were international condemnation, strong warnings about the dangers of this, but it appears that the shelling has resumed.
Yes, it has. And the International Atomic Energy Agency today, I believe, said that this shelling is dangerous, but it is not a risk to the nuclear facilities per se in terms of a nuclear risk. But these kinds of risks have continued for a long time. The Russians have engaged in activity which is really reprehensible from a safety point of view.
Yeah, the IAEA boss, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is saying that these latest attacks were a close call at Europe's biggest nuclear power station, But of course, neither Russia nor Ukraine have admitted that they were responsible.
Well, the Russians never admit when they are responsible. Those reactors, unlike the ones at Chernobyl, one of which blew up in 1986, the reactors at Zaporizhia have a high-pressure containment vessel, which helps protect the reactor. So it would take quite a pretty large explosion to damage that vessel.
So when we're looking at the most imminent threat to Ukrainians, it is simply this loss of power. Shouldn't the West perhaps be piling in more help on the ground to help reconnect power supplies, perhaps to provide generators, especially for civilians, for care homes, for those people who've got vulnerable people living there, because that appears to be the most immediate threat.
So the Ukrainians themselves have the capacity to repair the equipment that they have. And a lot of that is former Soviet equipment, so the West doesn't have the parts for some of those things. Parts could become a more serious issue for some of that repair.
And do you think that we're now going to see this conflict just somewhat frozen over the winter in perhaps all ways? The Russians have clearly not been able to make the progress that they wanted. There have been some significant gains made by the Ukrainians in terms of taking back places like Kherson. But there's no real sign of a breakthrough by either side in this conflict.
There's no sign of a breakthrough that is imminent. But the breakthroughs in Kharkiv and then most recently in Kherson have been quite striking. They have changed a lot of the public debate in Russia about the war. Russians are mystified at how they could have such gigantic setbacks, if you will, particularly after President Putin recently declared that he was annexing some of those areas to Russia. So the future of the war is a little bit uncertain now. It's very difficult to predict, always has been difficult to predict what will be next. But the Ukrainians have battlefield momentum, and they are likely want to continue that. The Russians also seem to be interested in continuing the fighting, and they have more mobilized troops that they're bringing to the front, although they're poorly trained. So how it's going to develop is just not yet uncertain.
And what about the prospect of any negotiations to try to bring the conflict to an end? There was this suggestion from President Zelensky that he'd had approaches suggesting that President Putin wanted some sort of negotiations. But of course, Ukraine's leadership has adopted a pretty hardline approach to this.
Yes, and that's the position of the West as well. Generally, the top Western leaders understand that it is not the right time for negotiations. Typically, negotiations occur when both sides have been fighting on the battlefield and they're both exhausted and have lost interest in continuing the war. That happened in the mid-1990s over the Bosnia War in the former Yugoslavia and helped lead to negotiated Dayton Peace Accords. But we're not at that point yet in the Ukrainian war. The Ukrainians have this battlefield momentum, and they want to keep fighting to defend their country.
William Courtney, adjunct senior fellow at the nonprofit RAND Corporation and a former special assistant to the US President on Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia. Really good to speak to you, William. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
You're quite welcome, Carol.